I'm Professor Peter Fox-Penner, Professor of the Practice at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. I'm also Director of the Institute for Sustainable Energy, a multidisciplinary university-wide research center at BU. First, let me summarize the proposal by saying it's really an idealized framework for climate policy. It isn't a specific set of very detailed proposals. And I want to emphasize that it is idealized. And I don't think the perfect should be the enemy of the good in U.S. climate policy. We have a climate policy and infrastructure debate going on right now in our country. It's very important that we make progress, and it's very important we make as much progress as we can, even if it doesn't follow the full outlines of my proposal. So my proposal is that the federal government requires states, or ideally groups of states that form regional compacts, to produce decarbonization plans with a required 2050 net zero target, and that the federal government not only require that planning, but contribute the infrastructure planning and support needed to effectuate those plans, which is inherently interstate in nature, and also crucially provide financing for the portions of their decarbonization plans that the market won't support. My proposals are very much like a steady stream of state climate planning laws and proposals that we're seeing spread through our laboratory of democracy. But on Capitol Hill, most of the discussion is about discrete programs. $50 billion for improved energy efficiency in housing, and another program for electrification of transportation, and other programs for industrial electrification, all of which are extremely important. However, those programs aren't inside a framework that I think is necessary, that takes us to full decarbonization and funds the infrastructure. Yes, and I strongly support the Biden administration's view of climate policy. The carbon emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions, are so much a part of all of our economic and social activity, all the way from our diet, which is most closely linked to the Department of Agriculture, to our transportation habits with the Federal Aviation Administration, to, of course, to energy, to every form of industrial activity, which is mapped to the Department of Commerce. It relates to education and every part of the government. And so the notion that one part of the federal government, whether that be a climate policy in the White House or the National Economic Council or the Department of Energy or the EPA, is in charge of transforming our economy in a massive, complex way to a net zero carbon economy, that would be an impossible mission for one particular part of the federal government. And so the idea that every part of government has an important role to play is exactly right, and is very consistent with the framework, in my opinion. Absolutely. Many states are adopting a framework that is extremely similar to what I propose in the paper, to my delight and surprise, because I assure you, I had practically no role in any of these state enactments. But just to give you an example, Massachusetts just adopted a new state law known as SB 9 that requires the state to adopt a net zero statewide plan by 2050, requires progress reports on that, the goal of reaching net zero by 2050 every 5 years, along with descriptions of all of the measures that are required. So the reason I wrote my paper, recognizing that many states are moving this direction, is that Massachusetts can't go it alone. It's really a good example because although Massachusetts can make quite a bit of its energy from rooftop solar and from very, very good offshore wind resources it's developing, it can't decarbonize the automobiles that it buys from that are not at all manufactured in Massachusetts with steel that uses carbon and plastics that use carbon. And that is part of the carbon footprint of the state of Massachusetts. So it needs a broader federal effort to couple with its very, very good state effort. But it is an excellent model. The European Union has adopted a model similar to this. Many industries and industry consortia have adopted very ambitious net zero by 2050, even net zero by 2040, which, for example, General Motors has adopted. So we see lots of work consistent with my proposal. My idea is that the federal government must become a partner in these efforts and provide the crucial elements that states and industries alone can't provide, and that is financing for some long-term pre-commercial non-market investments, notably infrastructure, and kind of a requirement that all of these plans for individual states or industry mesh together, because they can't be done as islands unto themselves. They won't succeed that way. Well, it addresses these issues the same way most other climate planning efforts address them, and that is to make them a required element of the effort, to make them integral to the effort. And in that way, I think my proposal is the opposite of unique. It's very consistent with this, you would say, the modern generation of climate plans. One of the reasons why I think it's important to include in the federal climate planning framework that I create is that some aspects of justice, just like some other aspects of the whole decarbonization transition, aren't local and require sort of a broad and common national effort in order to achieve greater justice. For example, federal standards like the federal minimum wage we're talking about and common federal access to healthcare and other elements really don't lend themselves to state enactments or local enactments. Now, in the energy and environmental justice area, I also want to emphasize that quite a lot of the real world environmental justice work is very local. It's making sure that energy facilities aren't located in communities of color, exclusively on that part of town, and the whole rest of that city or even that state is left free of pollution. So there's a very strong, important local element, but there's also some common national ingredients to environmental justice, and that's where my framework comes in. As I noted earlier, this framework is really, it's meant to be a way of thinking about federal climate policies that takes us out of program by program, appropriation by appropriation thinking, to stand back and look at the totality and say, does it add up to what we need to make a very ambitious target by 2050? And if it doesn't, how do we plug the gaps? And so the most important first step in applying my framework, I think, would be to look at what comes out of the current infrastructure / climate policy debate that is going on literally as we speak, and try to make sure that we haven't left some critical gaps unaddressed. The worst thing that would happen is for those critical gaps to lay there while Congress and the federal government move on and say, okay, we've taken care of this issue. We can forget about it for 5 years, where we only got 10, 15, 20 years to work on this. We can't let the gaps fester for 5 years and sit there unattended.